Hey guys, welcome to AP US History with Lennox, and today we're talking about the very first president of the United States. That's right, George Washington. Now, just to remind you, the Constitutional Convention had just wrapped up, the Constitution had been ratified, and we held our first presidential election, which Washington won unanimously. But now what? What's he going to do? He had a guide, he had the Constitution that told him that the power of the executive branch is vested in one president of the United States. But what does that mean? Yeah, I know some of his duties are outlined in the Constitution, like the commander-in-chief and the power to negotiate treaties with the approval of the Senate. But there's nothing in there that says this is how you create a presidency. So Washington's going to have to do it from scratch. The very first thing he's going to do is create a cabinet. Now, the cabinet is a select advisors who help the president run the country. We can't expect our presidents to know everything about everything in our country, so he brings in experts. The first cabinet is going to be surrounded by people that Washington had served with before. For instance, in this picture here, you can see to his right, that's Henry Knox. Henry Knox was one of his officers who served with him during the American Revolution. He will serve as the Secretary of War for the United States. Standing in the middle, Alexander Hamilton, this guy right here. Alexander Hamilton's going to be the Secretary of the Treasury, and he's going to have a big job. In fact, we're going to talk a lot about him in just a minute. Sitting down to Alexander's right is going to be Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson had been part of the United States during its formation. Obviously, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, but as the war came to an end, he is going to go to France as a foreign minister to represent our needs over there. He's not going to be here during the drafting of the Constitution, but once Washington takes office, he's basically called back to be the Secretary of State. And finally, to the far right, that's Edmund Randolph. Edmund Randolph is the very first Attorney General of the United States. He basically deals with the legal issues within our country and the legal issues our country has to deal with. Now, the very first biggest issue, I think, that Washington had to deal with was the debt. We were being buried by debt from the war. And so he is going to tag Alexander Hamilton to take care of that. And Hamilton is going to come up with a financial plan that's going to cause a lot of debate in our country. Yet, my opinion, it was genius what he did. Because he is going to be able to not only get our debt under control, but he's also going to create a system that will raise revenue, a system that will help our country grow economically, and a system that will bring credit to our country. So let's talk a little bit about this three-step plan that he created. His very first issue was dealing with the war debt. We owed money to France, and they wanted to get paid. The states also owed money, because remember, during the American Revolution, it was almost like we had two sets of armies. We had the state militia, and we had the federal army. Well, both of them rang up a huge bill. So what his plan is to put all that debt into one pot. Instead of having to pay off a whole bunch of small debts individually, each state is going to put all of their debt into one pot that will become a national debt. The problem some states had with that, some of them have already paid off their debt. And in doing so, why should they want to contribute to paying off the debt of other countries? That's going to cause a little bit of conflict, specifically between Hamilton and Jefferson, but a little bit more on that later. Another thing he's going to do is during wars, countries raise money by selling war bonds. Basically, bonds are loans that people give to a nation to get paid back later. Well, that's what the United States did during the American Revolution. They sold war bonds. They don't have the money to pay those bonds off. So what Hamilton is going to suggest is let's reissue the bonds. Everyone who has a bond that the country owes, we're going to reissue you a new one with a little bit higher interest rate. And we can't pay it all off right now, but we'll be able to make interest payments to you at least. So that way you'll be getting some money. And that's going to give our country more time to pay it off. That's going to help reestablish our credit and get us back in good standing. The next step is to raise government revenue. And when I talk about revenue, that's the government making money. And the way governments raise money is through taxes. Hamilton believed the way a country could grow economically was through manufacturing. He believed that manufacturers were the backbone of an economic system. So he proposed a tariff, and a tariff is a tax on any import coming to our country. And by doing that, he would raise the prices of imported goods, making American goods more desirable, and people would buy more American. You can see in this graphic right here, you have the choice. You could buy cloth from England or you could buy cloth from America. The English cloth has a tax on it. The American cloth doesn't. And if you just want cloth, it doesn't matter where you're getting it from. You're going to buy the cheaper one. So that was one way he was going to raise revenue. Another way is through taxes. And one tax that he's going to propose is a whiskey tax. It's going to be an excise tax, which is a tax on all whiskey that's manufactured and sold. Now, these two taxes, what they're going to do is they're going to provide a steady stream of income coming into our country. And that's what Hamilton needs to start paying off some of the debt, or at least paying off the interest of the debt we owe. The third part of his plan is to create a national bank. Now, obviously, we have revenue coming in. We have to have a place to keep that money. That's going to be the banks. But here's what's even more important about this bank plan. As money would come into the banks would then turn around and loan that money out to help build the economy. More businesses could grow. More manufacturers could start growing in our country because they're able to get loans from banks. Banks would get paid back those loans with interest. So if you think about it, as a national bank, it has money coming in from tax revenue, and the national bank also has money coming in from interest payments. So these are the three main parts of Hamilton's financial plan. This chart right here really breaks down how he basically controlled our national debt. If you look at the left-hand side of this chart, that's the debts. That's the money that America owed. We had $75.6 million in bonds that we had sold to help pay for the debt. You can see 42.4 was the national war debt, what the American government had sold in bonds or issued in bonds to get loans. 21.5 million came from those states. Remember, we put all the state debt in one basket. And then 11.7 million, that was owed to foreign countries like France. So when they loaned us money, we gave them a bond saying, hey, we're going to pay you back with interest, but we didn't have the money. The interest on those loans equated to about $4.6 million a year. So that is Hamilton's focus in this plan. Now look at the right side, the assets, where the money's coming from. You have $1.2 million that's going to come from excise taxes. Those are the taxes on whiskey that I just talked about a minute ago. And you also have $4.4 million that is projected to come in from the tariffs, from customs. When you see the word customs, they're talking about trade. You had customs houses that would accept the trade and collect the taxes and stuff. So you had $5.6 million in revenue coming from the taxes collected by Hamilton's plan. Well, if you owe $4.6 million in interest payments every year and you have $5.6 million in revenue coming in, that gives you a net of $1 million extra dollars a year that you can use to build the country. So basically what Hamilton did was he did push the debt down the road. But in creating this form of revenue coming in, he can start building our country. And remember, some other revenue is coming in from interest on loans. And those loans are going out to build manufacturing, ideas throughout the country. Now, be real careful. I always have to pause right here for a minute, because when I talk about manufacturing, I'm not talking about the factories that we are so familiar with now. These are small businesses, maybe, making weapons, making farming implements, stuff like that. And, of course, weaving cloth and everything. But don't think big, huge factories yet. That's going to come. But this is the beginning of manufacturing in America. And Hamilton said, this is the way we're going to make America work economically. Well, here's the thing. Jefferson had a real big problem with this because he did not think that the federal government had the power really to do all this. Yeah, they had the power to tax. It wasn't the taxes that really bothered Jefferson. It was that national bank. There's nothing in the Constitution about the government having the power to create a national bank. This brings us to this idea of how should we interpret the U.S. Constitution and how much power should the federal government have. Now, Hamilton's plan is obviously going to strengthen the federal government. It's going to make it bigger. He believes in what we call a loose interpretation of the Constitution, or a loose construction is sometimes what they say. And what that means is when you look at the Constitution, you take a very broad view. You don't just see black and white. You see gray areas. You see, phrases that allude to something else. And the one part of the Constitution is the last paragraph of Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which said that Congress has the power to do anything they deemed necessary and proper for the security of the United States. We refer to it as the Necessary and Proper Clause. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Elastic Clause. Well, Hamilton is going to say, though that wording right there, that Congress has the power to do whatever is necessary and proper, that gives him the authority to create a bank. Constitution doesn't just have to say you can create a bank. This necessary and proper clause says, well, this is necessary, so we need to do it. Let's make a bank. Jefferson's like, I'm not so sure about that. And he, along with James Madison, thought that that's giving the government way too much power. Now, what's interesting about this is Madison, who had been on Hamilton's side during the whole Federalist, anti-Federalist debate, because remember, Madison was a Federalist. He's coming back and saying, no, Hamilton's interpreting this wrong. And Madison's often considered the father of the U.S. Constitution, so maybe he knows what he's talking about. But he and Jefferson said that we have to look at the Constitution with a strict interpretation. What it says, it says. And if there's nothing about a bank in there, the government can't do it. It's that simple. And this necessary and proper or gray areas or reading between the lines, that's just playing with something that shouldn't be played with. That's playing with fire. And the last thing we want is a government that gets too big and too strong. And they felt that that's what Hamilton is pushing for. There had to be a compromise. You had Hamilton going against Jefferson, and I mean, man, these guys are going at it. And finally, Washington said, we need a compromise. We need to have a decision, because without Jefferson's support, Hamilton's plan, there's no way it would have been approved by the Congress. You see, Congress approves all plans created by the federal government. Hamilton could create this awesome plan, but it first has to go to Congress for their approval. That falls under those checks and balances. Well, half of the states in the Congress are from the South, and the South will do whatever Jefferson tells them to do. And if Jefferson and Madison don't think this plan is good, they'll convince Southern states not to vote for it. Hamilton can't have that. Washington can't have that, because they need to deal with this debt. So what happens is Hamilton and Jefferson go in and have and negotiate a compromise. And here's what it was. Jefferson's going to support Hamilton's plan. In exchange, we're going to move the capital, the U.S. capital, from New York down to what's going to become Washington, D.C., just on the border between Maryland and Virginia. So why would Jefferson want that? Well, you're moving the U.S. capital to the South. You're moving it out of that manufacturing area and moving it more to an agrarian area. And Jefferson, the other way he differed with Hamilton was he didn't think manufacturing was the foundation of the American economy. He believed that agriculture was. So by bringing the capital further into the South, maybe Washington, or maybe the federal government, would have more time, or I should say maybe the southern states would have more of an ear of the federal government. This new capital is going to become Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia. There you go. The land was actually donated by George Washington, and he's actually going to design the layout of D.C. So that's it. That's the beginning of Washington's presidency. And it was tough at first. It's even going to get tougher, because not only was Jefferson upset about Hamilton's plan, you have a lot of whiskey distillers who aren't too happy either. So up next, we're going to talk about yet another rebellion in the United States. This will be the third one already. First you had Bacon's Rebellion. Oh no, this is the fourth one. Bacon's Rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, the American Revolution, and coming up next, the Whiskey Rebellion. But until then, if you missed anything, you can always watch this again. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.